Do you ever feel like you're kind of being just lied to about this, like, so-called strong labor market? Well, I mean, the answer is you are, and that's not based on like a hunch or a feeling or really my opinion. It's based on actually looking at the data. Uh, and that's, as with anything in life, you kind of have to look into it a little bit. So, look, the reality is we just have special interest on steroids. The labor market is terrible. We don't have broad based job growth across these various industries. And ultimately, what that's going to lead to is the unemployment rate moving higher. Right now, we have a lot of job growth in something like government and healthcare. And that in and of itself is actually a textbook recessionary signal. So, look, I'm going to go through this data and we're going to look at it a variety of different ways because ultimately, doing that is just providing more insight. And I'm a big believer in just by simply configuring some of these visuals a handful of ways, it's going to really make some of these concepts stick. So, without further ado, I'll explain this visual we're looking at. It's really the non farm payrolls data just presented a handful of different ways. And this is from the establishment survey. So, when you hear non farm payrolls, think establishment survey. The establishment survey, as the name suggests, is employer facing. It doesn't make a distinction for multiple job holders, part time, full time, anything like that, like the household survey does. So uh, this doesn't even this survey actually doesn't even produce the unemployment rate. That actually comes from the household survey. The establishment survey, I think people are have this sort of wonky idea that whatever they're seeing in say those tables that are released monthly in those jobs report is really the extent to which uh, the data gets cut, and that just could not be further from the truth. There are so many cuts of this industry data. I mean, you can get way down into the weeds in some of these NAICS codes, and it's just going to provide just more sort of undeniable evidence that we just don't have really a strong labor market. So, uh, look, the establishment survey, they quote non farm payrolls on a month over month seasonally adjusted basis. That's what gets all of the attention. But again, that's just an aggregate figure. So for the month of February, it came in at 151,000. But that's just sort of an aggregate look, and we need to really understand where those jobs are being added. So below that is where I'm showing the month over month seasonally adjusted figures, but by industry and as a stacked bar chart. And it's sort of hard to see this data because really the trend over a long period of time, maybe it's a little easier if I just kind of zoom this in. You can kind of see those trends a little maybe easier. Uh, but again, there's just a lot of healthcare, private education and health services is primarily healthcare, and then government jobs. So I'll just kind of zoom that out again, so you can kind of see what's going on here. But this is seasonally adjusted. I'm not a fan of seasonal adjustments, but I'll show it because that's what gets all the headlines and grabs all the attention. Uh, that's a problem. Historically, when you've just had sort of lopsided job growth, that has really resulted in a recession pretty much every single time. It is a textbook recessionary signal on its own. So, look, a lot of healthcare and government here, here, and here. Recession every single time. And this is what I've done here is I'm showing the non-seasonally adjusted data month over month, but I've applied a 12-month moving average to the data, and it's just making some of those trends a little easier to see. So again, with just presenting the data a different way, it's just giving you more insight. And by the way, up here is non-farm payrolls, not seasonally adjusted, but what I'm doing is I'm just showing the aggregate amount of jobs. And so, what there's like 157 7 million jobs, according to the establishment survey. Now, wouldn't it be nice to actually know, say, what rolls up into something like, say, healthcare? So I'll just click through some of this various cuts of the data just so you can get a little bit more insight as to what's actually happening. So, what is this telling me? It's telling me that the bulk of jobs, if you were to just look at healthcare in isolation, a lot of it sits within the hospitals. Um, it's really seen outsized headcount growth post COVID, still sort of above the pre COVID trend in terms of job growth. But the other one that's really seen an enormous amount of growth, and this is really more of a secular trend, would be something like home health. If you want to look at job growth projections, that one is, I believe, is really at the top of the list. So there's been an enormous amount of investment there, and it only sort of makes sense if you just kind of think about the home health model. So what about government jobs? I know there's a lot of talk about Doge and everything else, um, but we need to make the distinction in terms of, okay, well, is it federal, local, or state? And when you look at this visual, especially this share chart up here, what you're going to realize is the bulk of government jobs are actually at the local level. And we've seen really outsized growth at the local and even the state level. Really, post COVID, that's really made something like this aggregate figure, which is the unemployment rate. Again, the unemployment rate gets cut a variety of different ways. It's not really behaving at you know today, which is I think the unemployment rate is at what 4.1% seasonally adjusted. The labor market itself is actually behaving in a much more unhealthy way than that one reading would actually tell you. So again, with the details matter. All of this is just giving us a little bit more color into what's happening. So why don't we go look at the household survey, which is what actually produces something like the unemployment rate. And this is, we'll just start with this particular chart where I'm showing uh, labor force participation rates by age and sex across various age groups. And really, I love to show this chart because this relates to housing more than people realize, especially when you start to notice that women join the workforce in absolutely enormous numbers, uh, really beginning, I would say, late 60s, early 70s. So if you want to think about something like dual income households, well, there you go. Right. So all this fluff around incomes are going to catch up to the cost of living when women are already in the workforce. I mean, if you want to think about the you know the difference between men and women in the workforce, it's almost 50-50 at this point, just in terms of straight headcount. So all this narrative is just unfortunately misleading people. So just kind of drives me nuts. But hey, if you want to look at something just like employment by age, you can do that with something like the household survey, otherwise known as the current population survey. So this has, as you're starting to hopefully pick up by now, has more of a demographic flavor to it. If you think about the name of the household survey itself, it is household facing. So it only sort of makes sense that it's going to capture a lot of these demographic trends. Now, what if we were to just say look at something like the unemployment rate, but by various age groups? I mean, look at how, I mean, we're talking 5 year age buckets here. You see how much more information that's giving you than, say, just the unemployment rate in isolation? That's an aggregate figure, too. So, just all of this data, just kind of, it requires looking into the details, people. So, it just kind of drives me nuts with all this fluff that people lead with these days. All I care about is the actual numbers. That's all anybody should really care about. So, now, what if we look at, say, reasons for unemployment? You see how this is just giving us much more information? And by the way, this chart up here, this stacked bar chart, is the unemployment rate. So job leavers, new entrants, all of these cuts of the unemployed is giving you just much more insight into what's actually occurring. So uh, what we're seeing here is really a textbook recessionary signal, and that permanent job losers and reentrants to the labor force, which again account for the bulk of the unemployed, are showing textbook recessionary signals. In fact, permanent job losers, anytime that thing gets above like 1% of the labor force, you're basically at the doorstep or you're in a recession. So, look, it's hard to see these trends when you have all these crazy ass COVID distortions. And if you were to say recreate this chart in Fred, this is what you're going to come up with, but you can't really zoom in on that thing, right? So that's why again I think there's a just a truckload of value in being able to pull this out and just visualize the data, say just a different way. So, but again, this is the unemployment rate. Note that I've said U3, that is the unemployment rate, but there are all sorts of alternative measures around labor underutilization. So U3, that's the headline unemployment rate, is obviously in yellow, but there are all these labor force flows that can really result in somebody falling out of even being, say, unemployed or even in the labor force. If you haven't been looking for a job like in the past 4 weeks, then you just fall out of it. So that's a very sort of narrow window into really the health of the labor market. U6 is the broadest measure, okay? And it is screaming that, hey, we are basically in a recession because that's accounting for like people who are like marginally attached to the labor force and working part-time for economic reasons and all that sort of stuff. So again, if somebody's gonna try and tell you that the labor market is healthy based on say like a 1 month trend or a 3 month trend, and that's all they're willing to show you, then that person is an asshole. And Kenny's tired of all these bullshitters because they're wasting your time and they're misleading you. So, oh Lord, I got myself all worked up again. But look, guys, just focus on the numbers. That's all that matters. Okay? All right. Have a good day, everybody.